Hello everybody, my name is Walter, and this is the third episode of my Redstone Tips and Tricks series. I've been asked occasionally whether certain blocks in my builds could be replaced by different blocks, so I decided to make this episode about block alternatives. I concentrate on the blocks commonly found in my builds, cover which blocks might be used instead, and explain possible exceptions, especially when it comes to blocks within Redstone circuitry. Now, the most common category of blocks I use in my builds are what I refer to as normal or building blocks. Those are full, movable blocks. The primary function of full blocks is that they can transmit redstone power, at least when it comes to redstone circuitry, which can be easily tested by just running some redstone wire into them, which is powered, and then checking whether they can, for example, transmit that power to a redstone lamp. Quite commonly used are things like dirt, cobblestone, other stone types, wool, if you want to colorize your circuitry a bit to see what circuit does what, or different types of wood, but you can also include light sources like the shroom light or the frog lights. They fulfill quite important functions. For one, as I already said, they are used to transmit redstone power, but they can also be used to cut off diagonally redstone power, as you can see here. Very, very useful in many instances, especially when we're talking about compact circuitry. One thing to keep in mind is that certain blocks can be taken up or picked up by Endermen, and those should be avoided. So if you go in the F3 menu and look at that block, you will see here on the right, Enderman holdable for the dirt. And that means an Enderman can go to your circuitry, grab that block, and break a circuitry. And that's obviously not something you would want. So those are blocks you should avoid. Next up, we have transparent and movable blocks. Nowadays, I prefer to use upside down slabs here. In my earlier tutorials, you will find me using glowstone instead. The primary function or the primary difference is that transparent blocks don't transmit redstone power. As you can see here, this lamp here is not powered, although you have the wire on the side here powered. Another function is that it also doesn't cut off redstone connections diagonally. And the third function is it does only transmit redstone power upwards diagonally, but not downwards. So it has a diode functionality, which is again very useful for very compact circuitry. Besides of upside down steps, you can also use all upside down stairs blocks. You can use glass nowadays. You can use the sea lantern or the glowstone block if you want to light up your circuitry. There are many, many similar options. The simplest way to figure out whether you have a transparent block is again just to check whether it can transmit redstone power as shown here. The next category of blocks is usually represented by obsidian in my builds, and those are the full and immovable blocks. Besides being full blocks and subsequently being able to transmit redstone power, they also can't be pushed around or pulled around. So this means that, for one, they don't stick to sticky blocks like the slime or the honey block, and for the other, they will also hard stop the movement of other blocks if they are in the way, which is very important for compact redstone mechanisms. Quite common examples for those blocks are, as I already said, in the obsidian block, which I default to usually. But you can also use the crying variant, or you can use the lodestone, or the furnace, the jukebox, dispenser, dropper, blast furnace, the smoker, the barrel, and so on. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that some of those have also interactions with comparators and observers. So the first exception is when you have a situation like this here. You have, in my build, for example, an obsidian block in between a block with an inventory and a comparator. And that means that the comparator reads the inventory of this block through this full block here. If you were to replace this with a barrel, for example, this connection gets broken, and now the comparator looks at the inventory of the barrel. And that's no longer the same circuitry. So that's the first exception. The second exception has to do with observer interactions. Sometimes observers, which are usually connected to slime blocks at some point, come to stop looking at an obsidian block, more or less by chance. And you can see when I power the obsidian block, nothing happens. This changes if I have a block that has a triggered state or a powered state. And you can see now, if I power or depower this, I get an interaction or it pulls out of the observer. And that can also play havoc on your circuitry. So this is the second abstraction where you have to be careful that you exchange the obsidian with another block that doesn't actually have an internal state that can be triggered via powering or depowering the block. Sometimes you can replace immovable blocks also with brittle blocks or slick blocks. Brittle blocks are blocks that when you try to pull them, will just remain in place, so they also won't stick to slime or honey blocks, but if you try to push them, they will instead break. This is why I refer to them as brittle blocks. Slick blocks, which are basically just the glazed terracotta types, can be pushed, but can't be pulled and also won't stick to slime or honey blocks. If those blocks don't get pushed in any case, then you can use them just as you would use an immovable full block. Just keep in mind that they have some differences in behavior, as you can see here. So they are not a complete alternative if you actually get them being pushed around, or if they need to stop the movement of other blocks. Next up, we have the cauldron and the composter. Both can be used as movable power sources for comparators, which can be quite useful if you want to hard-code programs using piston feed tapes and similar. The cauldron allows for signal strengths between 0 and 3, and the composter allows for signal strengths between 0 and 6 and the 8. So 0 to 8 minus the 7, essentially. If you only need the signal strength up to 3, you can replace one with the other. For example, in earlier days, we only had the cauldron. Nowadays, we have the less expensive composter, and you could now just make this little switcheroo to decrease the cost of your builds. Obviously, this doesn't work if you use the other functionalities of those blocks, whether it's farming liquids for with the cauldron or making bone meal using the composter. The next block is extremely unique in its combination of attributes, and that is the hopper. Now, obviously, the hopper can be used to transport items, but it also has other functionalities. For one, it has a powered state, which means it can interact with observers. It also has an inventory, so it can interact with comparators. It's also immovable. It's a transparent block, and it allows you to put redstone circuitry on top. This is a completely unique combination and means there is no real alternative to comparators if you need all of these combined. If you only need it, for example, as an immovable, transparent block with some redstone dust on top, without the observer and comparator interaction, then you can also use, for example, the scaffolding block. The downside of that is, for one, you need some kind of support, or you won't be able to just place it into the air. And for the other, it's a brittle block. So you can't actually use it to stop the movement of other blocks. So there are some limitations. But if you don't want to use the or as many hoppers, since they are somewhat expensive, then the scaffolding could be a possible alternative. Now, the last type of blocks you might want to be able to exchange are the sticky blocks, so slime and honey blocks. The main difference when it comes to those two in the Java edition is that the slime block is a full block and the honey block is a transparent block. In Bedrock, they are both full blocks. This means the connectivity of those two is obviously different as stated before. So there are some exceptions where you should be careful. First of all, when you have, for example, an observer running into the slime block, which then powers through the slime block this piston here. If I were to replace this with a honey block, this connection gets broken, and the circuitry or the mechanism will no longer work. That's the first exception. The opposite can also be true. In this case here, I have some wire which, for example, powers this piston here at the back, but I don't want to power the piston I'm moving via the honey blocks here. If I were to replace this with a slime block, obviously I would now have a connection, and this piston here would be forcibly powered. So when you have redstone wire mostly running into honey blocks, then it's a bad idea to exchange that with slime blocks. And the last exception is when you already have points where slime and honey blocks are being right next to each other. If you just exchange one, then it would stick to the other. So here you would have to do the switcheroo for both. Finally, you can see me putting X into hoppers in many of my bigger builds, and this is because X have a stack size of 16. This is used to get rapidly changing analog signals that decrease or increase depending on the power levels, and is very important to get fast piston extenders for many of my builds. I use X more out of habit because once you have an egg farm, it's very easy to get one, but there are other alternatives you can use if you don't want to use X. Of course, you can use buckets if you have an iron farm somewhere. You can also use signs, or and this is likely the cheapest alternative, snowboards. You could also use, if you have an Enderman farm, some Ender pearls. And with that, we get to the part you've likely been curious about from the very beginning, which is this little corner here at the back. And this is just my 7x7 double wall door, spruced up a bit to show you what you can actually do on the visible surfaces, so the blocks that are not really part of the circuitry itself. Here, there are pretty much only two different types of blocks you need to use. For one, you need to use blocks that don't attach to slime and honey blocks, which I usually make out of obsidian, but as you can see here, I've used lodestone blocks, but you can use pretty much all of those blocks here, or you could also go with slick or brittle blocks here. And the rest need to be movable. They don't even need to be full blocks. So you can see in some places I've put some stairs in there. You could also use slabs and similar, depending on what you need. Additionally, there are also spaces that are not occupied by any block, even during the closing and opening sequence. And in those places, you can also add more blocks to give the entire thing a bit of a more 3D structure. So this is just a few ideas to tickle your fancy. So anyway, this is the inside. On the outside, I also did some replacing of blocks. So you can see I've marked some circuit parts with different colors. I also used some scaffolding over here. The important part when you're doing this, for example, to replace those hoppers here, is that you make sure that there is actually a solid support somewhere. So it would look like this scaffolding is supported on the slime block over there, but without this scaffolding here, the moment the door starts to move, this scaffolding here is no longer supported and would break, which is the reason I need this connection over here. So just a few little ideas where you can actually make use of all of in this here. And with that, we've reached the end of this episode about block alternatives. I hope you enjoyed it, and well, see ya!